woke up with my father's hand around my throat and my mother pouring a bottle of tequila into my mouth while my older brother watched and laughed. I wasn't being attacked by strangers. I was being welcomed home for the holidays. In my family, sobriety is considered a betrayal, and the only way to belong is to be an addict. My parents are the most feral people I have ever met, and they have spent my entire life trying to drown me in the same poison that is currently killing my brother. From the time I was 10 years old, every Friday night was training night. We would sit at the kitchen table while my dad poured shots, and if we gagged or coughed, we had to do push-ups until our arms collapsed. The family rule was simple. The family that drinks together stays together. My brother Kyle took to it perfectly, becoming my dad's favorite drinking buddy by the time he was 14. While he was being rewarded with motorcycles and gaming systems for his high tolerance, I was labeled the family disappointment because I wanted to stay sober and get straight A's. By the time Kyle turned 18, the damage was becoming visible. His skin was turning a sickly shade of yellow, and he complained of sharp pains in his side, but my parents just laughed it off, calling it a weak stomach and handing him more scotch. I realized then that if I wanted to survive long enough to escape to college, I had to become an actress. I spent years pretending to be drunk, secretly pouring my drinks into plant pots just so they would leave me alone. When I finally left for Oregon State, I discovered a world where people actually had fun without destroying their organs. I joined a support group, started running marathons, and finally felt the fog lift from my brain. But during my sophomore year, I made the biggest mistake of my life. I went home for Christmas, thinking I could finally be the one to break the cycle and save my brother. The second I walked through the door, the trap snapped shut. When I refused a beer, my mother's face turned into a mask of pure hatred. She called me a sanctimonious witch and told me I was ruining the holiday. That night, they broke into my room. While my father pinned my arms down, my mother forced the bottle into my mouth. When I finally gasped for air, she poured the liquid down my throat until I threw up. They just laughed and said I was out of practice. I managed to record them through a cracked door later that night as they joked about breaking me back in, and I called 911 from my closet while my heart hammered against my ribs. But when the police arrived, the nightmare only got deeper. My parents transitioned from monsters to concerned, loving parents in a heartbeat. They told the officers I was having a mental breakdown and that I had been unstable since I left for college. The most terrifying part wasn't the attack. It was realizing that my parents had prepared for this for years. They had fake medical documents, letters from family members, and a paper trail designed to make me look like a delusional addict. Even as my brother Kyle was being carried out on a gurney with his liver failing, he looked me in the eye and told the police I was the one who was sick. My father's friends in the local government and the bowling league began a smear campaign against me on social media before the sun even came up. I watched my reputation crumble in real time as the whole town offered prayers for my poor parents who had to deal with such a troubled daughter. My bank account was drained, my tuition money was stolen, and I was eventually forced into a psychiatric hold by a judge who played poker with my dad every Sunday. I am sitting here now, realize that when an entire community is built on a lie, the person telling the truth becomes the villain. I'm not just fighting my parents anymore. I'm fighting a whole town that would rather see me in an asylum than admit their traditions are actually a death sentence. The walls of the psychiatric ward were a sterile, mocking white, a sharp contrast to the dark oak and velvet shadows of my parents' house. I sat on the edge of a plastic bolted bed, my throat still feeling like it had been scrubbed with sandpaper from the forced alcohol and the vomit. Every time a nurse walked by, I tried to speak calmly, remembering what my marathon coach always said, control your breathing, control the race. But the intake notes already had me marked as paranoid and prone to fabrication. My parents hadn't just put me in a cage. They had built the cage out of my own words. They had taken every diary entry from my childhood and every frustrated text message I'd ever sent and turned them into symptoms of a disease I didn't have. I realized then that my father's real talent wasn't business. It was stage management. He had spent 20 years making sure that if I ever spoke the truth, it would sound like a lie. 2 days into my hold, Uncle Tony appeared in the visiting room. He didn't look like a lawyer. He looked like a predator in a cheap suit, smelling of peppermint to hide the morning whiskey on his breath. He sat across from me and pushed a single piece of paper toward me. It was a voluntary commitment form. He explained that if I signed it and admitted I had a substance abuse problem, my parents would drop the charges of filing a false police report and pay for a luxury wellness retreat in Florida. If I didn't, they would let the psychiatric hold turn into a long-term state commitment. Think about it, he whispered, leaning in close enough for me to see the broken capillaries in his nose. Your brother is dying in a hospital down the street because of the stress you caused. Your mother hasn't stopped crying. The whole town sees you as a monster. Why not just take the easy way out? Admit you're sick, go to Florida, and let us handle the rest. I looked at the paper and then at his shaking hands. He was a mirror of what my father wanted me to become, a compliant, high-functioning shell held together by secrets and spirits. I didn't sign. Instead, I spent my recreation time in the common room, watching the local news on a bolted-down television. There was Mr. Davidson, my dad's golf buddy, giving a human interest report on the tragic rise of mental health issues in college students. He didn't name me, but he used my parents' house as the backdrop, talking about a prominent local family dealing with a daughter's sudden descent into instability. My father stood in the background, looking somber and aged, holding my mother while she dabbed at her eyes with a silk handkerchief. It was a masterpiece of propaganda. They were turning my survival into a cautionary tale for the whole county. I felt a cold realization sink into my bones. The police, the hospital, and the news were all part of the same bottle. They all drank from the same well, and none of them were going to help me because doing so would mean admitting their own traditions were crimes. On the third night, a night shift nurse named Elena came into my room to check my vitals. She didn't look at me with the usual pity or suspicion. She looked at my chart, then at the bruises on my arms where my father had pinned me down. "That doesn't look like a self-inflicted injury," she muttered, almost to herself. I stayed silent, terrified that any word I said would be twisted into a delusion. But then she leaned over and whispered, "I live 2 doors down from Dr. Chen. She told me you might be here." My heart leaped. Elena explained that she had worked in this facility for 10 years and had seen plenty of troubled kids from the town's elite families come through these doors whenever they got too loud about what was happening at home. She told me that my father had made a generous donation to the hospital wing that morning. They weren't trying to heal me. They were waiting for the alcohol in my system from that night to be processed so they could claim I was detoxing and use it as further proof of my addiction. Elena helped me more than any doctor could. She managed to smuggle my phone back to me for 10 minutes. I had dozens of notifications, but I ignored the hate mail from my aunts and uncles. I went straight to the cloud backup of the video I took from the closet. It was still there. The sound of my mother's shrill laughter as she joked about breaking me in was chillingly clear. I also saw a message from Benji, the bartender. He had sent me a photo of a ledger from the back office of the bar. It was a tab my father had been paying for years, not just for our family, but for several local officials. It was a map of the town's corruption, paid for in liquid currency. I realized I couldn't just defend myself. I had to burn the whole system down. I sent the video and the ledger photos to an investigative journalist in Portland, far away from my father's golf buddies and the local sheriff's influence. The next morning, the evaluation team came to my room. My father was with them, looking every bit the heartbroken patriarch. He sat at the foot of my bed and reached for my hand. I pulled away, and he let out a long, theatrical sigh. "She's still in the middle of it," he told the doctor. "The paranoia, the rejection of the people who love her. It's heartbreaking." The doctor, a man who I knew played poker with Uncle Tony, nodded and began scribbling in my file. He mentioned long-term residential treatment. That's when I looked my father dead in the eye and said, "I know about the ledger at the bar, Dad. I know about the tabs you've been paying for the sheriff and the judge. And the video of Mom forcing that bottle down my throat? It's already out of this county." The mask didn't just slip, it shattered. For a split second, the concerned father disappeared, and the feral, violent man from Christmas night returned. He lunged at me, shouting that I was a liar and a traitor, before the orderlies had to pull him back. He had finally lost his composure in front of witnesses who weren't on his payroll. The fallout from my father's outburst in the psychiatric ward was the first crack in the family's armor. The doctor couldn't ignore a man trying to assault a patient in a high-security facility, even if that man had donated a new lounge. The hold was lifted, not because they believed me, but because I had become a liability. But walking out of those doors wasn't a victory. It was the start of a war. I had no money, no home, and my brother was still dying. I drove straight to the hospital where Kyle was being kept. The air in the intensive care unit felt heavy with the scent of antiseptic and impending death. I found his room, but my mother was standing guard like a gargoyle. She didn't scream this time. She just looked at me with a cold, dead stare. "You've killed him," she whispered. "He was the best of us, and you've dragged our name through the dirt so much that he's given up." I pushed past her. I didn't care about her drama anymore. Kyle looked like a ghost. His skin was the color of a lemon, and his breathing was shallow and ragged. I sat by his bed and took his hand. It was cold and trembling. "Kyle," I said, "the journalist from Portland is running the story tomorrow. It's all coming out. The training nights, the tabs at the bar, everything. You don't have to protect them anymore. You can just be a brother." For a moment, his eyes flickered open. They were bloodshot and yellowed, but for the first time in years, they looked clear. "I was always so jealous of you," he rasped, his voice barely audible over the hum of the heart monitor. "I wanted to be the favorite. I thought if I drank enough, I'd be strong enough to handle them. But the more I drank, the smaller I got." He started to cry, silent tears leaking down his jaundiced face. He admitted that he had been going to AA meetings in secret because he was terrified his heart was going to stop in his sleep. He had been living in a constant state of terror, performing the role of the golden son, while his body was rotting from the inside out. That night, the story broke. The headline wasn't about a troubled daughter. It was about the secret cellar of Pine Creek. The video of my parents attacking me went viral, but it was the ledger, the bribe book from the bar, that really set the town on fire. People who had looked the other way for decades suddenly found their moral compasses when they saw their own names or the names of their elected officials on a list of people bought and paid for by my father's liquor cabinet. The sheriff was placed on administrative leave by noon. The judge who signed my commitment papers suddenly retired for health reasons. The perfect community was revealed to be a fragile house of cards, built on a foundation of shared addiction and mutual blackmail. My parents' house was surrounded by news vans, not for a tragedy, but for a scandal. But the victory felt like ashes. My phone was still a war zone. My extended family, the aunts and uncles who had also trained their children, realized that if my parents fell, they were next. They sent me messages that were no longer just insults. They were threats. "You've ruined everyone's lives," one cousin wrote. "Do you think you're safe now? You've destroyed 100 years of history." I realized that generational trauma doesn't go quietly. It fights like a cornered animal. My parents were arrested 2 days later, not for the assault on me, which was still being investigated, but for a litany of financial crimes and bribery uncovered by the ledger. I watched the footage of my father being led away in handcuffs. He didn't look like a titan of industry anymore. He looked like an old, shaky man who hadn't had a drink in 12 hours. He was sweating and stumbling, the very image of the disorder he had tried to project onto me. The hardest part was the day the doctors told us Kyle wouldn't survive without a transplant and that he wasn't eligible because of his active history of consumption. My parents had convinced the local doctors to hide his symptoms for so long that by the time he got real help, it was too late. I spent his final hours in that hospital room, listening to the machines beep while the world outside discussed my family like a true crime podcast. When Kyle passed, he didn't go as the golden son or the favorite companion. He died as a 30-pound shell of a person, a victim of a tradition that valued loyalty over life. At his funeral, which I attended under the protection of 2 private security guards I hired with the GoFundMe money, not a single relative spoke to me. They stood on the opposite side of the grave, a wall of black suits and hidden flasks, looking at me with pure, unadulterated loathing. I am back in Oregon now, finishing my degree. I have a permanent scar on the inside of my throat from that night, a physical reminder of the gift my mother tried to give me. My parents are currently awaiting trial, and the town of Pine Creek is slowly trying to scrub the stain of the Hollister name from its streets. I am still running marathons, still going to meetings, and still waking up in a cold sweat dreaming of the smell of cheap tequila. People ask me if I'm glad I broke the cycle. I tell them that breaking a cycle feels a lot like a car crash. You might survive, but you're never the same person you were before the impact. I lost my brother, my home, and my past. But as I sit in my quiet apartment, drinking a glass of plain water and watching the sun come up with a clear head, I know one thing for sure: the Hollister tradition ends with me. I am the first one in 4 generations to actually see the sunrise, and for the first time in my life, I'm not afraid of the light.